This is Uncle Navi, back with another chapter of the Ship Crusade. Opal is off on the balcony inspecting smells because unfortunately one of us is a dork and, plastic handles on pots can get smelly if you heat them up too fast. Oops. So, Chapter 3 The Ship Who Killed. Every diverted synapse in Helva's shell-encased body vibrated in unconditional revolt against the autocracy of the Central World Service. All haste, she snarled in impotent revolt to her sister ship, the 822, on the private ship-to-ship band on which not even CENTCOM could eavesdrop. Seld Ilsa snorted unsympathetically. You're doing something, which is more than I can say. In mediation service, I've spent weeks and weeks on end waiting for them to make up their minds which planetary crisis is most crucial. By the time we get there, critical mass has been reached, and we have a hell of a lot of mess to clean up. What, you think MedServ doesn't procrastinate? Helva retorted sharply. Why, Janet and I... And she stopped, startled to have been able to mention his name. Ilsa took advantage of the brief pause and grumbled on, oblivious to Helva's stunned silence. You'd think they'd have briefed us better in training. When I think of the situations I've already encountered that were never even mentioned, theory, procedure, technique, that's all we handled. Not even a single practical suggestion, just garbage, trivial garbage. They don't need brain shifts, they need computers. The 822 ranted on. Stupid, senseless, unemotional computers. Helva spotted the fallacies in 822's complaints, but remained quiet. She and Ilsa had been classmates, and she knew from past experience the voids in each other's personality. I heard, the 822 said confidentially, that your mission has to do with that blue block building in the hospital annex. Helva adjusted her right fin scanner, but the oblong structure was devoid of any unusual feature that would indicate its contents. Have you heard when I'm supposed to hasten away from here again? She asked Ilsa hopefully. Can't talk now. Here comes Seld back. See you around. Helva watched as the 822's brawn half ascended to the airlock, and the SI-822 lifted off of Regulus center base. Seld had partied with Jenin in Helva one time, when both ships were down at Leviticus 4. Seld had a passable base, as she recalled it. Envy briefly touched her. She flicked back to the ambiguous hospital annex, savagely wondering what kind of emergency this could be. And would she remain an ex-designate for the rest of her service life? She had sat down at the end of the great Regulus field, the farthest edge from the service cemetery. Despite her resignation to Jenin's loss, despite Theoda's healing tears, Helva could not bring herself to grind more salt into her sorrow by proximity to Jenin's grave. Perhaps in a century or so. Consequently, waiting around on Regulus was painful, and with the 822 gone, she could no longer divert her pain into anger at the prolonged wait she must endure. Kilo Hotel 834, your brawn is on her way with assignment tape, CENTCOM alerted her. Helva acknowledged the message, excitement stirring within her. It was almost a relief to receive a double initial call, the pleasure overriding her twinge of regret that her brawn partner was feminine. It was a relief, too, to experience any emotion after the numbing of Jenin's death. The Anagoni experience had broken her apathy. A ground car zipped out from the direction of the massive control and barracks complex, skidding to a stop at her base. Without warning, Helva lowered the lift and watched as a tiny figure hefted 3 pieces of baggage onto the platform. Kay meant to stay a while, Helva decided. The lift ascended, and shortly her new brawn was framed in the open lock against the brilliant Regulan sky. Kira of Canopus, requesting permission to board the X-Ray Hotel 834, said the young woman, saluting smartly toward Helva's position behind the titanium bulkhead. Permission granted. Welcome aboard, Kira of Canopus. The girl kicked the limp lump of fabric bag unceremoniously aboard, but she carefully carried the other 2 back to the pilot's cabin. The odd-shaped one Helva identified, after a moment's reflection, as an ancient stringed instrument called a guitar. Naturally, they'd send me someone musically oriented, she thought. not at all sure she was pleased with this infringement on her most cherished memories of Jenin. She ruthlessly suppressed this unworthy thought with the admonition of the majority of service personnel were musically oriented. The infinite possibilities of the art passed travel time admirably. Kira flipped open the other compact case, and Halva, surreptitiously peeking, noticed it was full of vials and other medical equipment. Kira inspected the contents with quick fingers and, closing the case, strapped it with care against the rigors of acceleration on the shelves behind the bed. Kira was, in form and nature, as well as sex, the antithesis of Jenin. Since she was in a carping mood, Helva wondered how much of that was intentional. But that would mean CENTCOM had more sensitivity than Helva decided privately they were computationally blessed with. Kira of Canopus couldn't weigh more than 40 kilos fully suited. Her narrow face with slanted cheekbones had a delicacy which appeared ill-suited to bear the designation brawn. Her hair, dark brown, was braided tightly in many loops around her long oval skull. Her eyes, wide and almond-shaped, were of clear, cool, deep green, thickly lashed. Her fingers, slim and tapering, were as dainty as her narrow feet, oddly graceful in heavy ship boots. Her movements, swift and sure, were quicksilver full of restless energy, dartingly inquisitive. Kira re-entered the main cabin. Helva, used to Theoda's lethargic movements, had to adjust quickly. Kira inserted the order tape, locking it into its niche in the pilot's board. As the code ran through, a startled exclamation was wrung from Helva. 300,000 babies? Kira's laugh was a staccato arpeggio of mirth. Assignment Stork, by the holies. You're only temporary, questioned Helva, trying to keep irritation out of her voice. There was a magnetism about Kira that appealed to Helva. Kira smiled wryly. This assignment will take some time. Only 30,000 are collected already. Even in this day and age, it takes time to make babies. I haven't got the facilities, Helva began, aghast at the thought of becoming a nursery. She broke off as the tape elaborated on the condition of the proposed cargo. Babies in ribbons? Kira, who had a previous briefing on the mission, laughed at Helva's outraged reaction. The tape continued remorselessly, and Helva understood the significance of the miles of plastic tubing and tanks of fluid that had been placed in her not over-generous cargo spaces. The system of the star... In the system of the star Nakar, an unexpected radiation flare had sterilized the entire population of its newly colonized planet. A freak power failure had resulted in the total loss of the planet's embryo banks. The KH-834's mission was to rush embryos to Nakar from planets that had answered the emergency call. In the early days of space travel, when man had still not walked on Mars nor Jupiter's satellites, a tremendous advance had been made in genetics. A human fetus in its early stages was transferred from one womb to another, the host mother bringing the child to term and giving it birth without having an actual relationship to it. A second enormous stride forward in propagating the race of man occurred when a male sperm was scientifically united with female ova. Fertilization was successful, and the resultant fetus was brought to term, the child growing to normal, well-balanced maturity. It became a requirement of those in hazardous professions, or those with highly desirable dominant characteristics of intelligence or physical perfection, to donate sperm and ova to what became known as the Race Conservation Agency. As civilization expanded onto newer and rawly dangerous worlds, the custom was for young men and women to leave their seed with the RCA on reaching their majority. It was good sense to have such a viable concentration of genetically cataloged seed available. Thus, given a lack, say, in a generation of particularly desirable ethnic group, sufficient additional embryos could be released to restore the ecological balance. On an individual basis, the young wife, untimely widowed, might bear her husband's children from his seed on file at the RCA, or a man wishing a son of certain pronounced genetic characteristics to perpetuate a family name or business would apply to the bank. There were, of course, ridiculous uses made of RCA facilities, Women in the thrall of hysteria over a noted space ranger or an artist would apply to the RCA for his seed if the male in question was agreeable, but naturally conceived children were the rule rather than the exception. Helva herself had been the naturally inseminated child of her parents. Generally, the RCA served Central Worlds as a repository in case of just such an emergency as had arisen on Nakar. The inability of individuals to propagate their race. An appeal had reached the main RCA on Earth to locate and deliver 300,000 fertilized ova of genetic type similar to the Neckarese. RCA had 30,000 on hand and had forwarded the call to all major RCA banks throughout the Central Worlds, asking for contributions, which the KH-834 would pick up and deliver to Nakar. The tape ended with a silent hold cue to Helva. It took her a moment to realize that, though she had the mission information, she had received nothing on her new partner. No matter how temporary this assignment, it would take time. Some basic biography would be essential for Helva to function effectively in partnership with Kira. Obediently, she cut the tape, activating a record store of the balance for later playback. It would appear that there were many unusual factors in this assignment. Central Worlds moves in mysterious ways, itself to sustain. Well, Helva exclaimed to end the brief silence after the mission portion of the tape was silent. I hadn't expected motherhood at my tender age. I see I have underestimated the demands Central Worlds makes of its minions. Opal, would you like to come inside?
Okay. She is still outside investigating.
Her attempt at levity touched off a violent response in Kira, and Helva wondered what under a first magnitude star had she got for a partner. Read this tape on me before we proceed in the mission, Kira said in a dead voice, all her previous vivacity wiped out. She slammed the store button, shunting the mission tape to the ship files, and inserted a second reel. With an almost savage twist, she turned on the audio, sitting stiffly erect and motionless as the tape played back, either deaf or impervious to the biograph. Kira Falanova Mirsky of Canopus had finished all but a year of Brawn training. She came of a service-oriented family that had brought up 10 generations to illustrious and once exalted careers in the Central World's service branches. She had left the training school on marital leave that had lasted 2 years, ending at her husband's death. A long term of hospitalization and therapy followed, during which time, the tape noted, Kira had asked for and taken medical training, but did not reapply for Brawn education. She had responded to a high-level request to take this temporary assignment, since her training had matched perfectly the needs of this particular emergency.
You're going to have to come in the other door. I'm home. Yeah. You can come in. That door's just pulled.
Then followed a rattle of personal indices, emotional, psychological, and education, which Helva translated, as she was expected to mean that Kira Mirsky of Canopus would make an unusually fine Brawn if she gave herself half a chance. The tape ended abruptly, as if there should be more. The emission, probably on the last tag of the mission reel, seemed to sing out its absence far louder than the tritest concluding evaluation or recommendations. Central Worlds had many devious facets, and perhaps such an obvious omission was one. Surely, Kira sensed it. That damned biograph left too much unsaid, particularly apparent to a Brawn trainee. Helva's mind danced with the possibilities and gnawed mental teeth against the silent hold cue. In the meantime, Helva was faced with a very awkward situation. Her new partner, stiff with anticipation, and predisposed by Central Worlds to make a bad first adjustment to Helva. Helva made a rude, sibilant noise, and she was relieved to see Kira react in surprise to it. Brains they got, Helva demanded contemptuously. I don't call that a proper tape. They forgot half the garbage anyway. And she repeated her exasperation noise. Oh well, I expect we'll do fine together, if only because they left out the unusual nonsense. Besides, the mission is temporary. Kira said nothing, but the woodenness left her slender body as if an anticipated ordeal had been cancelled. She swallowed hard, licking her lips nervously, still unsure of her position, having steeled her nerves for something unpleasant. Well, let's get the cargo aboard and turn me into a rocking ship. Kira rose, her body awkward, but she managed to smile at Helva's calling. With pleasure. Have your holds been outfitted? With yards and yards of lacing and a bicycle built for two. Helva replied, quipping from an ancient patter song. She was determined to establish a comfortable empathy. Kira's smile was less tentative, and her body motion became more fluid. Yes, it would look like that, I guess. Of course, I've never seen a bicycle built for two. Nor a purple cow, and Kira giggled girlishly.
Opal has sneaked out through the kitchen. Well, you know where the open door is, Goober. I love you do this. I love you.
She walks out to the porch through the kitchen, and then sits at the porch door in the living room, as if she can't come back into the kitchen. I love this dog. Purple cow, my dear Braun, is an all-too apt analogy for a present occupation, Helva replied, ignoring the edge to Kira's laughter. And don't tell me I'll have room for 300,000 mechanical teats in the cargo space Central World saw to outfit me with. Oh no, Kira said. We don't have to have but the first 100,000 accounted for, as of the time that this tape was cut. We'll swing out from Regulus toward in a car, picking up donations as we go, deliver them within the 4-week time limit when the fetuses must either be implanted or decanted, and swing around the wheel until we meet the quota. Helva knew this from the tape. 300,000 isn't a very big number for a planetary population of 1 million that needs to expand. Oh, my dear, Kilo Hotel 834, and Kira savored the name. The word temporary, particularly when used by our beloved service, has elastic qualities of infinite expansion. Also, another team with drone transports is recruiting orphans from unsocialized worlds to ensure the proper age variations, but born children aren't our concern. Ah, the heavens be praised, Helva muttered under her breath. She did not have room to transport many active live bodies, nor the inclination, not so soon after all. Kira smiled back at Helva over her shoulder as she contacted the hospital unit to request transfer. Will you activate the pumping equipment? She asked Helva, who was in the process of doing just that. The miles of plastic tubing, once filled with the tiny sacs of fertilized ova, would contain the nutritive and amniotic fluids necessary for the growth of the embryos. The contiguous ribbon of tiny compartments, each with its minute living organism, was prepared for the voyage with the caution and care of a major surgical operation on the head of a planet. Or on a head of a planet. Head of planet. Each segment must contact an intake point for the nutritive fluid and an outgo valve for the dispersal of wastes. Each meter of ribbon was inspected to ensure the proper contact was made. The ribbon and its fluids, as well as the encasing tube, buffered the embryos with more invulnerability against the rigors of space travel than had they been carried in a natural womb. As long as the KH-834 made the journey to Nekar within the 4 weeks, all 30,000 fetuses would live to be born. It became apparent to Helva that Kira was dedicated in a detached, professional way to the assignment. Central Worlds might be relying on maternal instinct as additional insurance for the mission. Helva, to her inner amusement, found herself, the pituitary inhibited shell person, rising nobly to the challenge. Kira, obviously young enough to someday enjoy motherhood, was completely uninvolved. Yet the affinity Helva felt towards these minute voyagers was basically a shell reaction. They were, after all, encapsulated just as she was, the difference being that they would one day burst from their scientific husks, as she never could, nor even desired to. Still, she felt a growing protectiveness above and beyond the ordinary toward her passengers. The situation didn't appear to touch Kira's psyche, and that puzzled Helga. She struggled to identify the coldness of Kira's reaction and could not. Then the technicians who had effected the installation of the precious cargo withdrew, and Helga was busy with the mechanics of takeoff. It was a pleasure to have a passenger who knew how to take care of herself. Not that Theoda had been a burden in the psychological sense of the word, but Kira knew the procedures, and Helva did not need to spare a thought towards her. Takeoff was under minimum thrust, not that the triply buffered embryos could suffer damage had she blasted off with all power, but Helva preferred to take no unnecessary chances, and there was plenty of time to reach the Nakar and the Butis sector. First planet of call would be Talitha, where 40,000 future citizens of Nakar had been prepared. After lift, Kira made a careful check on all circuits in the nursery, confirmed her findings with Helva's remote monitors, and informed Sancom that they were clear of Regulus and driving towards Talitha. The formalities ended, Kira swung slowly around in the gimbaled pilot's chair, her slenderness lost in the padded armchair. She seemed both too fragile and young for her responsibilities. The larder is well stocked, Helva suggested. Kira stretched leisurely, moving her shoulders around to ease the taut muscles across her back. She shook her head sharply, sending a shower of hair fasteners slithering across the cabin as her braids came tumbling out of the cornet. Helva watched, fascinated. Shoulder-length hair was common fashion among spacewomen. The tips of Kira's braids brushed the floor. Whatever maturity she possessed departed with a severe coif. Like the prototype of an ancient fantasy creature, Kira rose from the pilot's chair and moved across the deck to the galley. You wouldn't by any remote computational factor stock a beverage known as coffee? Kira asked wistfully. Helva chuckled, remembering Onro. It seemed to be an occupational necessity. I have 3 times as much as normal service inventory suggests, Helva assured her. Oh! And Kira's eyes rolled upward. Oh! And Kira's eyes rolled upward in mock rapture. You know! The ship that brought me here was a provincial transport from Draconis, and hadn't a drop on board. I nearly perished. Kira flipped open the proper cabinet and broke the heat seal, sniffing deeply as the fragrant... Pardon me, dear. I need to excuse myself for a minute. My dog is a doofus. In. I love you. Why are you like this? I love It's funny knowing at the beginning that I'm gonna have to re-record this eventually. I love you, dog. You are such a bonehead. Yes, yes, yes. You are the cute one. Yes, I love you very much. Good girl. Go lay down. I'm reading. I know you're cute, but I'm reading. We can go to bed after. Go lay down. Love you. Love you very much. Go lay down. This dog. Ugh. Kira flipped open the proper cabinet and broke the heat seal, sniffing deeply as the fragrant aroma rose from the heating liquid. She gulped down a sip, grimacing against the heat. With an expression of intense relief, she leaned against the counter. You and I are going to get along nobly, Helva. I'm sure of it. Helva caught the rasp of fatigue in the lilting voice, which she always received passengers in the advanced stages of exhaustion. Or was something the matter with Helva that all her visitors tended to fall asleep once aboard her? As a nursery ship, this could be an asset, Helva thought acidly. It's been a long day for you, Kira. Why don't you get some rest? I'm staying up anyway. Kira chuckled, knowing that the brain ships never slept. She glanced towards the cargo holds. I'll listen with my ears perked, Helva reassured her. I'll just finish my coffee and take a short snooze. Kira agreed. At the cabin door, she turned back towards Helva's column, cocking her head slightly, her green eyes sparkling. Helva, do you peek? Her expression was prim to the pursing of her lips. I assure you, Helva replied, with great dignity. I am a very properly mannered scout ship. Scout. I am a very properly mannered ship, Scout. I shall expect you to conduct yourself decorously at all times, as behooves a person in your position in life, Kira replied so haughtily that Helva imagined her pedigree sprinkled with royal ancestors. Head high, Kira stepped into her cabin, only to trip on one of her swinging braids and tumble into the room. Helva was sorely tempted to get a glimpse of Kira's face. Don't you dare look in! Kira exclaimed, her voice breaking with laughter. Helva had promised nothing about turning off sound and heard Kira giggling softly. In a short while, only the sound of a sleeper's shallow, slow breathing broke the stillness of the ship. Helva took out the portion of the tape which followed the hold cue. The excerpt was brief and enigmatic. Scout Mirsky is a practicing Dylanist, accepting this assignment in Central World Service without suspension of her craft. Accordingly, she is not to be permitted shore leave on the following planets, as her activities constitute an infringement of planetary laws restricting proselytization of government groups and or an embarrassment to Central World Service. Ras Al Gothi, Ras Al Hag, and Sabak. Subject, scout, and ship designate are not, repeat, are not, to approach planets of stars Baham and Homan in the Pegasus sector, nor planets of stars Bade and Cade in the Eridanus sector. Nothing could be clearer than that, but the reasoning behind such restrictions was unfathomable. And Kira was a practicing Dylanist, whatever that was. The name had a familiar ring to it, and the guitar that Kira cherished suggested a musical group of some sort. Well, mused Helva, she let it come up in conversation naturally. The 6 days to Talitha were livened by Kira's rapid switches of mood and manner, from gaming to queen, welcome to Helva after Theoda's stolidness, and a counterpoint to her painful memories of Jenna. Helva literally did not know what Kira would do next. However, when it came time to check their passengers, Kira was deftly professional and painstakingly thorough. Drub, the second planet of their tour, called in to confirm a contribution of 40,000 fertilized ova to be ready at touchdown. Kira checked computations on ETA at Drub, arriving at the same figure simultaneously with Helva. Child she might look, child she might play, but Kira's working mind was sharp and accurate. The transfer at Talitha went without undue incident because Kira's acute attention to detail averted the one possible accident. An attendant, too eager to finish his assignment, tripped over the heads to a fluid tank in the now crowded cargo hold. Kira lit into him with a furious catalogue of his ancestors, his present worth, his future current career potential, and his probable imminent demise if he repeated his awkwardness. She did so in 3 languages other than Basic that Helva knew, and several that had the advantage of sounding even more vicious. Yet, the minute she had exhausted her caller, she turned, coolly collected, to the head of the detail with apologies. Once lifted from Talitha, Kira shook loose the pins that held her braids and settled into the pilot's chair with a sigh of relief. I caught 3 of your descriptions of him, but the others were beyond me. I find that old Terran Russian, mixed with liberal Numagirostan. I had this the first time I read it. Numagirostan is extremely vitriolic in sound, Kira said. Actually, I was only repeating a recipe for a protein dish called paprikash. It sounds much, much worse, doesn't it? She grinned broadly at Helva, her green eyes wide. Effective, too, the oaf positively blanched. Thorn, and Kira cut off her words, pressing lips firmly together, her face, for one tiny moment, showing inner pain. I think, she murmured, closing her eyes, I'm hungry. Her voice was breathless, like a child's, and, her eyes flashed open, her face composed again, I think I shall make paprikash, since you realize I have just furiously remembered the accurate recipe. She danced across the floor. Taught me by an old gypsy. She waggled her finger at Helva. Promise not to peek. It's a family secret. She pivoted on her toes, round and round into the gallery, laughing breathlessly as she caught the counter for support. Doesn't it smell heavenly? Kira demanded of Helva. Later, pausing with the dish raised to Helva's collar. Be better with noodles and a thick, crusty bread. She mumbled happily over a full mouth. Oh, perfect. I have not lost my touch. She put her fingers to her lips, releasing a kiss to the air in the extravagance of gustatory enjoyment. Marvelous! She curled her legs under her on the wide pilot's chair and ate quickly, licking her fingers occasionally when the stew splashed. You make me wish I wasn't nourished by a bunch of flagons, Helva remarked. I've never seen anyone enjoy the simple business of eating as much as you do, and you don't seem to suffer from excess calories. Kira shrugged negligently. Excellent metabolism. Absolutely unalterable, that's me. That fleeting edge of bitterness crept into the gay voice. Helva began to suspect that these sudden switches of mood were less the product of a naturally volatile spirit than the elaborate defenses of a badly hurt woman, struggling to suppress her pain by overriding all references to it. Helva remembered how carefully the guitar case had been stowed in the closet. Not so much as a hint had Kira made that it was there, silently waiting. Was this out of deference to Helva's recent tragedy? For surely Kira knew of Jenna's death and the legends that had already begun to cling to the 834. Or was Kira avoiding the guitar for a reason of her own? Kira had finished her meal. The dish lay on her lap, her face brooding, her eyes fixed on a spot at the base of the control console. Her whole attitude was apathetical and unhealthy. Helva knew she must break this mood. Kira had somehow been touched on too vital a point, despite the overtly innocuous conversation, to help herself. Softly, without conscious choice from the wealth of musical references, Helva began to sing an old air. Music for a while, shall all your cares be gone, wondering how your pains were eased. How my pains are eased, hissed Kira, her eyes, great green globes, glittering with hatred at the titanium column. Do you know how my pain will be eased? She was on her feet in such a violent upward heave that there seemed to be no intermediate motion of rising. Tall and fiery, Kira frightened Helva with the sudden strength in her slight body. In death! In death! She held her arms straight up, wrists turned forward to Helva so that she saw the thin, white scars of arterial cuts. You, and Kira's arms dropped rigid to her side. You had the chance to die. No one could have stopped you. Why didn't you? That what kept you living after he died? The girl demanded in trenchant scorn. Helva drew in her breath sharply against the tantalizing memory of an anguished desire to dive into the clean, white heart of Ravel's exploding sun. Do you realize that even if a person wants to die, it is not allowed? Not allowed! Kira began to pace wildly, graceful even in this savage mood. No, you promptly are subjected to such deep conditioning that you cannot. Anything else is permitted in our great society except the one thing you really want, if it happens to be death. Do you realize that I have not been left alone in 3 years, and now? Kira's face was contorted in ugly anger and contempt. Now you're my nursemaid, and don't even think for one moment I'm not aware that you have had a confidential report on my emotional instability. Sit down, Harlow ordered coldly, and activated the final section of the mission tape with its restriction. As the import of the message reached Kira, she did sit, slumped, lifeless in the cold chair, or in the pilot's chair, her face drained of all emotion. Oh, I'm so sorry, Helva. I'm really sorry. She raised trembling hands in apology. I, I just didn't believe they would leave me alone at last. They're very good at conditioning, Helva remarked softly. They must be, and they have to be. They can't have ships or people going rogue from grief, but I think they have let you alone. They've merely made sure you can't get to those few worlds where ritual suicide is permitted, like Baham, Homan, Bade, and Cade. And they can't allow you to suicide because of the ethos of Central Worlds, or because the ethos of Central Worlds is dedicated to extending life and propagating it wherever and whenever possible. I am a living example of the extremes to which they are willing to go to sustain a human life. The RCA is another aspect of that same ethos. For you to seek suicide means a breakdown in this ethos, which cannot be permitted. Even the Pegasus and Eridani planets limit the conditions under which suicide is condoned, and proscribe certain grotesque ceremonies to ensure that only the most desperate attempt it. For the record, I am correcting verbally every instance of the word ensure because it bothered me every time a book gets it wrong, and this book gets it wrong every single time. It's very frustrating. Ensure is to guarantee. Insure is to get paid. Frustrates me. You'd think, Helva sighed with exasperation, they'd figure out some way to alleviate loss, since death is the one thing that the great and glorious Central Worlds hasn't been able to cure. Kira's tumbled hair hid her face from Helva's view. Even the slim fingers were motionless. The girl had abandoned herself to grief, and suddenly Helva was immeasurably irritated with this immolation and self-pity. True enough, she had been tempted to commit suicide, but her conditioning had held. She had keened her loss to black space, but she had lifted with Theoda to Anagoni and had gone on with the business of living, just as Theoda had after her own tragedy, as many people had, all over the universe and throughout time. When her medical advisors had realized that Kira was wallowing in sorrow, they should have applied a block. Oh no. No, not when Kira had nearly finished her brawn training. Helva remembered that factor. She had been made block resistant, so the only therapy was intensive conditioning. They couldn't erase, only inhibit. Helva looked dispassionately at her brawn, furious at her situation, realizing that Central Worlds had known exactly what they were asking of Helva when they assigned Kira to her. That too was part of the ethos. Use what you have that will get the job done. Kira, what is a Dylanist? The lowered head jerked up, the curtain hair falling away from the face. The scout blinked and turned to stare at Helva's bulkhead. Well, that's the last question I would have expected, she said in a quiet voice. She gave a little snort of laughter and then tossed her head, shaking her hair out of her way. She looked at Helva thoughtfully, speculatively. All right, I will absolve you of the guilty crime of psychotherapy, although, and Kira pointed an accusatory finger at the column. Where's the camera? Damn it. I'm trying to point at the camera. I was coerced to take this mission, and I thought it awfully suspicious that you were my ship. Yes, that would follow logically, wouldn't it? Helva agreed calmly. Kira laid a slim hand on the bulkhead, on the square plate that was the only access to Helva's titanium shell within the column. It was a gesture of apology and entreaty, simple and swift. Had Helva been aware of sensory values, it would have been the lightest of pressures. A Dylanist is a social commentator, a protester, using music as a weapon, a stimulus. A skilled Dylanist, and I wasn't one, and from the emphasis on the pronoun, Helva assumed that Kira considered her husband, Thorn, had been one such, can make so compelling an argument with melody and words that what he wants to say becomes insinuated into the subconscious. Subliminal song? Well, haven't you been haunted by melody? Kira paused at the door of a cabin. Yes, I have. Helva agreed, not sure that the theme from Ravelodoris's second celestial suite was exactly what Kira had in mind. Still, the point was well taken. A really talented Dylan stylist, Kira continued, returning with the guitar case, can create a melody with a message that everyone sings or hums, whistles, or drums in spite of themselves. Why, you can even wake up in the morning with a good Dylan-styled song singing in your head. You can imagine how effective that is when you're proselytizing for a cause. Helva roared with laughter. No wonder you'd be considered an embarrassment to Central Worlds on the Ophiuchus Circus. Ophiuchus Circuit. Kira's grin was impish. I got the chapter, verse, and section on that. Plus, what a waste of time, talent, and stability that could be to put worthwhile use in service to the CW. She made a face as she struck chords, sour from the instrument's long disuse. She tightened the keys, tuning up from the bass string, her expression unexpectedly tender as she worked. She struck a tentative chord, tightened the E string a fraction more, to nod satisfaction at the resulting mellow sound. With flashing, strong fingers, she wove a pattern of chords and notes, drawing more volume from the instrument than its fragile structure suggested. To Helva's amazement, she recognized an ancient Bach fugue, just as Kira struck an angry discord, clamping both hands on the strings to keep them from resonating. Ah! She exclaimed, sharply flapping her hands and then clenching them into tight fists. I haven't played since... She struck a minor chord and then modulated to a diminished minor. Ow. I remember we spent one entire night, till noon the next day actually, trying to analyze an early Dylan song. The trouble was, you aren't supposed to analyze Dylan. You had to feel him. And if you tried to parse what he was saying into basic or psychological terms, it was It was meaningless. It was the total imagery of the music and the words that made the gut react. That was the whole purpose of his style. When the gut reacts, the mind gets the whiplash, and another chip is knocked off of the solid block within. I'd say his work might be good therapy, Helva remarked dryly. Kira flashed her an angry look that dissolved into a grin. She made the guitar laugh. The trouble with therapy is you tend to find too many confusing alternate meanings to the simplest motions and words, and then you're so confused you suspect everyone and everything. And Kira's guitar echoed the pitch of her words derisively. A red warning light flashed on the panel simultaneously with an impulse to Helva's internal monitors. The guitar was the sole occupant of the pilot's chair, and Kira was halfway down the passageway to the number 3 hold before Helva could activate her own visual check. Kira paused at the hold door long enough to assess the damage before she spun to the farther hold, where their additional supplies were stored. The clumsiness of the technician had, to all scrutiny, been remedied at the time and of the accident by securing the tubing in the demijohn of nutritive fluid. What had not been apparent at the time was that the closure at the other end of the line had been loosened. Sufficient of the fluid had dripped away from the weakened joint to register on the telltale. Helva anxiously checked with her magnified vision along the section of embryos serviced by that tank. There was loss at the joint, but the ribbon was still full. Kira was back with new tubing and joints. Deftly, she removed the faulty equipment, careful in her transfer to prevent air bubbles seeping in along the ribbon. Then she checked the entire length of the ribbon and each minute sac, under magnification, to make certain there were no visible bubbles nor disruption to the contact between the sac top and the nutritive nipple fastening. Nipple. Then she checked the joints in the other ribbons, each line, each flask, every connection. It was a job of several hours' duration, but she made no attempt to hasten the process. Reassured, she and Helva did another check of the internal monitors before she once again closed the hatch. I should have cut him up and made him into paprikash. That would have served him right, Kira muttered as she disappeared into the privacy of her cabin. Helva eavesdropped until she heard the slow, even breathing. All the time the mute guitar stared back at her from the pilot seat, threads of that haunting melody plaguing Helva as she maintained her vigil. At Duba, Kira insisted on an elaborate spectrum inspection of the distributed ribbon to make sure none of the several thousand fetuses within the strand had suffered impairment. Whatever emotional problems tormented Kira, she held them apart from her professional life. Her objectivity was more than appreciated by Helva because she had a glimpse of Kira's personal turmoil. The KH-834 sped onward from Duba to Merak, where another 20,000 waited. On the short voyage between Duba and Merak, neither Kira nor Helva mentioned what Helva styled the paprikash incident. Kira did not put the guitar away, but spent some time every evening giving Helva additional samples of Dylanist wit and social penetration from the ancient dream songs of the protest decade in early atomic history to the contemporary examples. When the call from Alioth came, it interrupted Kira's masterful rendition of a very early Dylan, Blowing in the Wind. Kira carefully laid aside her guitar and answered the call. Her face registered polite surprise at the origin. 15,000, she repeated for confirmation, and received what Helva felt was an unnecessarily curt rejoinder and cut off. While Kira had been dealing with the call, Helva had activated the ship's memory files on facts of the planet. Well, that's odd, she remarked. How so? Asked Kira, jotting down an ETA computation. There's no record of them even having a bank. Grim Planet, it was in a highly unstable volcanic period. They use a lot of molten mining techniques, highest mortality rate in the Central Worlds. I think, commented Kira dryly, you'd better see what CENTCOM has to say about our landing there. Well, it's not on the restricted list, Kira, Helva replied, but she activated the type beam. Alioth, Sencom exclaimed, surprised out of its formal voice. The Mayday didn't go out to them. We've no record of a bank there. Ethnically speaking, it's possible. Hold one. Kira cocked an eyebrow at Helva. They're checking with I know who. 2 gets you 1 that they abort the call. 2 gets me 1 of what? Gibbered Helva. Kilo Hotel, Sencom returned. Proceed to Alioth. No bank listed, but traders reported improvements in mining techniques indicate technological advances at proper level for race propagation. Religious hierarchy powerful, so do not antagonize. Repeat, do not antagonize. And report soonest. You just lost 2 of whatever it is that you just bet. Helva taunted. Okay, Kira said with a shrug. Film bank have any clips? Helva flashed them on to the viewer. First were aspects of the small spaceport. The main city was dominated by an enormous temple built against the side of an extinct volcano. The broad, multiple steps leading to it reminded Helva of a ziggurat. She didn't much care for the worlds with a religious hierarchy, but she was aware that her opinion was, at the moment, jaundiced. Too many religions were doom and gloom. Alioth, 4th planet of its solar system, was far enough out of its primary to get a little bit of its brightness, and its volcanic era predisposed it to Dantean excesses. Dantean excesses. One last scene showed a procession of torch-bearing cowled figures crossing a huge central plaza in front of the temple. A truly cheerless place, Kira said, making a face. Well, with only 15,000, we can't have to stay long. She strummed a gay tune to counteract the morbid pictures. Well, they are in the ethnic group required by Nakar, Helva remarked dubiously. Can't see a thing with all those hoods, Kira said. You don't suppose the embryos come complete with cowl, do you? That'd be a facer for the Neckarese. And she giggled, adding a guitar laugh. You should say, born with a cowl. Kira threatened Helva with the guitar, then made her inspection with the 3 holes. For those of you who know Road to El Dorado. This extra 15,000 will crowd us a little with the 20,000 at Merit, Kira said as she wrote. Alioth is spatially aligned with Nakar. We can make it there with time to spare. Then, Hayatoho off on another stork run. Kira straightened, wrinkling her nose in Helva's direction. Hyotoho is utterly inappropriate for a stork run. For you, maybe, but not for me. I am, after all, an armored maid. Ha! Kira fell silent as she peered through a magnifying lens at a joint. When the 2 had finished the inspection, Kira paused at the galley, reached absently for coffee. She wandered, moody for the first time in nearly a week, into the main cabin and plunked herself down into the pilot's chair, curling her feet under her and sitting quietly, only the vapor of the heating coffee moving. Stock run, she said finally. Do you realize, Helva, I'm the same ethnic group too? Those pieces of life are the children of people like me, only unlike me because they have left seed, and I have none. Don't be ridiculous, Helva snapped, hoping to ward off a Kiran explosion. You've made your RCA duty when you reached your age of majority, didn't you? No, Kira snapped back. No, I didn't. I had met Thorn by then, and I was going to have all of my children. I didn't need any agency to ensure the propagation of those chromosomes that are essentially Kira Falatinova Mirsky of Canopus. As a matter of fact, she said sardonically, I even wrote a Dylan on the RCA full of wit and drollery, with candid cracks about uncanned child. She swung her chair round to face Elva, her eyes narrowing in self-contempt. One of the many items my so-censored biograph left out was that my only child died aborting from his mother's womb untimely ripping it and rendering her completely barren. Kira spanned her tiny hips with slender hands. No life in these loins ever, not implanted nor impregnated. No, nothing of thorn or all we had together. That for our supreme, egotistical self-assurance. It was for such accidents that the RCA recommended seed donations from every young adult. It was pointless to remind Kira of this. She was all too patently aware of her folly. That's why I returned to medicine after Thorn's death rather than to service. But all my studies proved that there was no rebirth in me nor birth from me. Science can do many wonders, make many adjustments, but just not that. She sighed heavily, but her bitterness was not as frantic as that first explosion. Helva wondered if Kira had resigned herself to barrenness, as she had not, from appearances, resigned herself to living. Which is why, dear Helva, it is ironic to me, of all people, to be assisting this particular cargo from around the Great Wheel. Helva refrained from any remarks. Kira finished her coffee and retired to rest. With a few hours, there would be Merrick to deal with, and then on to Alioth. They cleared Merrick in record time, the technicians being both quick and careful. Alioth was only a few days onward before the last spatial hopped in a car. Scout and ship had now achieved a pleasant routine in which Helva filled gaps in her classical and ancient musical repertoire with Kira's comprehensive acquaintance with folk music from Old Terra and the early colonial periods of now major worlds. Helva woke Kira just before touchdown on Alioth. The scout dressed quickly in a somber tunic, braiding her hair so closely to her scalp, Helva wondered her head didn't ache. Touchdown was not auspicious. To begin with, the spaceport was overshadowed by the jagged, glowing peaks of Alioth's active continental spine. They were told to touch down some distance from the small rectangular building that housed what spaceport control and administration the inhospitable planet required. Kira protested that they were too far from the building to effect a quick transfer, and was brusquely informed that she was to await the arrival of a ground vehicle. It took its time in arriving, a huge transport truck loaded with cowled figures who took positions around Helva's base, elbow to elbow. Their belligerent attitude and presence seemed an insult to a ship bearing Helva's markings. Alright. Dearest, it is almost an hour in. I have work in the morning, and Opal is making eyes. So we will finish chapter 3 next time. And in the meantime, just remember, people can hate without knowing you, and I can love you for exactly the same reason. So, get some rest, and be somebody that you can be proud of. I'll talk to you next time.